Welcome to this episode of the Fig Files. I am your host and fig pig, Stephen Biggs. This is all about how to grow figs and harvest figs in a cold climate. Have you ever wondered what kind of potting soil to use when you repot your potted fig tree? Or have you ever wondered how to make your own potting soil? If so, this video is for you. Let's start by thinking about what the potting soil does for our fig tree. Of course, it's the place where the fig roots grow, but the potting soil also holds water, holds some nutrients, and in some cases, it will provide some nutrients too. A question that I commonly get is, can I just use soil from my garden? The answer is no, at least not on its own. So what should your potting soil be like? Well, what we want is we want some air pockets in there so that the roots can breathe. I know people don't think about that, but roots do need to be able to breathe. If they're somewhere where the soil is packed down, or if they're somewhere where they're always wet, then your roots will die. So we need some air in our potting soil. But at the same time, we need a potting soil that will hold some moisture so that your plants have access to moisture. So air, moisture, and as I said, we don't want it to pack down like a garden soil might. And remember, in a potted plant, we have this situation where we're watering it frequently, and that can cause that soil to pack down. So we want a potting soil that has this combination of some air spaces in it, but at the same time it can hold some water so that when that plant needs water, it can access it. When it comes to commercially prepared potting soils, most of the ones that you'll find in North America don't actually have any real garden soil in them. Part of the reason for that is the weight. Garden soil is heavy. It costs money to ship heavy things. So usually we get what's called soilless potting mixes. And what that means is that these potting mixes, another term for it is potting soil. If you're in the UK, they might call it compost as another name for potting soil. These potting soils, these soilless mixes, some people even call them growing media. There's an organic portion, which could be something like forestry waste that's been composted, or it could be something like peat. It could be something like coir. So you have this organic component to it, and then that is bulked out with some kind of lightweight aggregate, like perlite or vermiculite. And sometimes you'll find some potting mixes are also bulked out with forestry waste like chips of bark. So those are very common products in the marketplace. Very often you'll find that there's limestone added, especially to peat-based growing mixes, because that adjusts the pH and makes it more suitable for your figs. And then, of course, some potting mixes come with a fertilizer in them. Not all of them, but many do. And one thing I'd like you to think about as you go out shopping for potting soils is the idea that there are some that are prepared for homeowners, and there are some that are prepared for commercial growers. So those smaller bags that we find for sale at garden centers, they're the ones that are made for homeowners. The large bags, large bales is another word that's often used for them. They're these big compressed bags. Where I am here, we get 3.8 cubic feet compressed. These are big, heavy bags, but they're prepared for industry. They're prepared for commercial greenhouse growers or commercial nursery producers. I like to use this commercial format because I find that the quality is consistently good. When we're talking about those smaller bags that are made for homeowners, I find that the quality is all over the map. So first of all, you pay more for the smaller packages, but also that the quality is very variable. So I'd recommend going with those commercial format. Now, you might decide to take some kind of commercial potting soil like that and just run with that and use that for your fig. That's fine. You might also make something from scratch, or you might do something like take a commercial potting soil and then tweak it, make some adjustments to it so that you think it's the best thing for your fig. And if you were to talk to 10 avid fig growers, you might come away with 10 different soil mix recipes, because it's a little bit like home cooking. You talk to 10 different people about their favorite tomato sauce recipe, you'll come away with 10 different tomato sauce recipes. It's exactly the same with soil for your fig trees. And that's fine, because The right soil for you will depend on a few things like your watering habits, how you're feeding your fig tree, and the size of the tree that you have. If you're mixing your own potting soil completely from scratch, and if you're making it a peat-based potting soil, there's something that's really important to know. There are different qualities of peat that are available. And when peat is taken out of a peat bog, the peat that's closer to the surface of the bog, it has longer fibers, has better properties for moving around water. The peat that's lower down in a bog has a darker color. It's more highly decomposed, and it's not as well suited to making into a potting mix because it doesn't move around the water as well. So the peat that's from the top of the bog is called blonde peat. That's what you'll find in those commercial grade potting mixes, and that's the kind that you want to make the best potting mix. Now the thing is that this blonde peat isn't often available in garden centers for homeowners. And there are a lot of people out there touting homemade soil mixes talking about peat, but without that distinction between the blonde peat and that more highly decomposed dark crumbly peat that is just normally used as a garden soil amendment. So take note, blonde peat is what you want if you're starting from scratch. I talked about those organic components like your peat or your coir or your composted sawdust, whatever you're using as your base organic material, being bulked out with some of these light aggregate materials like peat and perlite, and you can buy those at garden centers. Another aggregate that some people add to their soil mix is sand. And with sand, one thing to keep in mind, and it can be good or bad depending on what you want, is that it adds weight. But say, for example, you're growing a fig tree in a pot, weight is something that can be important because we don't want our fig trees to tip over on a windy day. And a lot of these soilless mixes are quite light. So this can happen that the trees will tip over in the wind unless there's a little bit more weight in the pot. So we've got our bulk organic material like the peat or the coir or the forestry waste. We've got our aggregates like the perlite, the vermiculite, or the sand. And then some people will add something into the mix to feed the fig. And that could be something like manure, composted animal manure, or it could be something like alfalfa or composted kitchen waste. Something that I'm seeing more often in garden centers is composted seafood waste. And an example of one that I find for sale here in the Toronto area is something called shrimp compost. And that can be an excellent addition to your fig potting soil as well. In other parts of the continent, and I know in Western Canada, they have what's called sea soil, which is a combination of composted forestry waste along with composted seafood waste. Just as I was saying earlier that different people have different fig soil recipes, different people will have different key ingredients too. I knew one grower who insisted on using composted rabbit manure. I've talked to some people who use baked clay cat litter, which is an interesting one because it drains well. It's this coarse material, and yet being clay, it can also hold moisture too. We've been talking about potting soils and soilless mixes for our figs and the different ingredients that can go into those. Let's talk now about garden soil. And I started off by saying don't just use straight garden soil when you're repotting your potted figs. That doesn't work. It's usually too heavy and it packs down. Having said that though, I do like to add some garden soil into my potting mix for my figs. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it adds weight. I mentioned earlier how figs can tip over in the wind if the soil mix isn't heavy enough, so I like that added weight. But having some real garden soil in there, it has this buffering effect too. So there's less likelihood of nutrients not being available to your fig tree. And also, good garden soil can help hold some moisture, more than just a straight peat mix, for example. So I always add garden soil to my mix for my bigger fig trees. Those smaller trees, just cuttings that I've just potted up, or very young trees that I'm trying to rapidly grow into a mature size, for those I'll use just a straight soilless mix, but for my bigger fig trees, I use a potting mix that includes some garden soil. One more thought on garden soil for you is that in some places there are nematodes in the soil, nematodes that are a problem for fig roots. And if that's the case in your area, good chance you'll know about it because your neighbors who are gardeners will talk about it. But if that's the case where you are, then you will not be using garden soil in your fig potting mix. Let's talk about recipes. At this point you might be thinking, okay, just give me a recipe. So I'll tell you a common recipe that I've used for my larger potted figs over the years. I use 1 part garden soil, 2 parts of one of those commercially prepared potting soils, like I was talking about, those ones that come in the big bales, so 2 parts of those, and then 1 part sand. A very simple mix. Not an exact science. It doesn't have to be exactly the same every time, but this is a very good general purpose growing mix for your larger potted figs. In the UK, there's a long tradition of using potting soils with a garden soil component called the John Innes soil mix. And when I worked at a nursery in the UK and we grew fig trees, it was the John Innes potting soil mixes that we used for the fig trees. And that was with 7 parts of garden soil, or garden loam as they call it, 3 parts of peat or a peat substitute like coir, and 2 parts of sand. So that was the John Innes mix. Now, in the UK, where there's more of a tradition of commercially available garden loam based potting soils, what they do to get a very nice garden soil to add to a soil mix is they'll take turf and they'll stack it and let it decompose. And so you have the soil, but imagine those decomposed blades of grass and roots in there too, so it gives a nice crumbly high quality soil. Some people ask, well, do I need to sterilize the potting soil for my figs? No, you don't. And where you want a sterilized soil is if you're starting seeds, or sometimes people like it with cuttings, because those there can be disease organisms in the soil which might not be a problem for a mature plant, but with little seeds or cuttings they can be. But don't worry about sterile for repotting your larger figs. Summing up then, some key thoughts on potting soil for your figs. Don't cheap out. Don't buy those discounted bags at the big box stores, because soil quality can be all over the map and often you get what you pay for. So buy a good quality mix. I really recommend getting a commercial format. You won't regret that. Lots of different recipes out there, so depending who you talk to, you might come up with a different recipe. I do like some garden soil in my mix for my mature fig trees, and if you're making it from scratch, get blonde peat. Don't buy that really crumbly dark peat that is sold as a garden amendment. For more tips and ideas about how to grow and harvest figs in cold climates, head over to foodgardenlife.com. There's a whole library of articles and interviews with experts and a free ebook all about growing figs in cold climates. foodgardenlife.com.